Hello, church. Welcome to chapter 29 and 30 of the book of Genesis. And as we read about this today, we're continuing this fascinating story that is a continuation of all those covenantal promises of the Lord. And there's some few interesting twists and turns in here. And one thing that really strikes me in chapter 29, verse 18 to 20, is when Jacob sees Rachel. When Jacob sees Rachel, he's got to wait for 7 years to marry her. He's going to work for those 7 years. That is a huge cost for something that he has to wait for. And yet, to him, it ended up seeming like only a few days. It's interesting to me the parallel between that and the perceived cost or the actual cost that we have for following Jesus. What would seem to the world, it's very obvious. There's a big cost to following Jesus if you actually follow him like he would like you to follow him. And yet, for those of us who do, you realize that if you actually have a passionate relationship with him and you fall in love with him, as it were, you recognize that that cost becomes so small, it actually flips around to becoming a profit, right? That actually becomes great good that we say, "Why, I would never trade that for anything else," which is exactly what the Apostle Paul said in Philippians chapter 3. And so that's something to look at. And you could even ask yourself, is there anything that is hindering me right now from having that kind of personal relationship with the Lord? And then in verse 21 of that same chapter, I want you to see something. Jacob is waiting. He is engaged, if you will, to Rachel, and he waits for 7 years through his engagement before he can sleep with her, and that's very obvious in verse 21. Here is another example. I just want to point this out. By this early time in reading through the Bible, this is all very much pre-law. God hasn't given that law through Moses yet, and yet we can already see very clearly how God sees sexuality and the moral laws that go with it. We've already seen his view on homosexuality, on fornication, which would be like sex before marriage. This would be an example of that. We've seen his perspective on adultery with Abimelech and these different stories where we've seen God's heart on that. And we've also seen how Job took a stand even against lust, and in Job chapter 31. And so we have really already got to see God's heart in regards to the moral laws of sexuality. That would just lead us to an obvious question of, do I live according to God's moral standards that are unchanging? And so as we keep on reading, there might be other things that stand out to you. We get into this place where we recognize, of course, the story goes, Jacob has to work for 7 years. Then there's the whole switch with Rachel and Leah, and those two weddings that happen a week apart. But then Jacob works for an additional 7 years. He's been deceived. He already had to work for 7 years, big cost, then deceived into working another 7 years. And yet, here's what happens. You'll notice in chapter 30, verse 31, for instance, that when he's finished working his 14 years, and then his father-in-law says, "What can I give you?" And Jacob says, you don't have to give me anything. And it really speaks to Jacob's integrity and his work ethic. He has worked long and hard for what he has been given. And that would be an easy question for us to ask today. Do I have that same level of integrity with my work and even work ethic? 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 talks about that. Paul said that was a command that he had given to them. And the Bible would even say in Acts chapter 20 that it is more blessed to give than to receive. And so sometimes we get lost in this idea that we want to get rich quick, and we daydream about that, when the biblical mandate is to work hard and have integrity about that. And so consider that. Maybe that's something you want to hold before the Lord today. And even in this place, I want you to notice that in chapter 30, verse 34 to 36 or so, it seems very apparent that Laban is actually trying to trick Jacob again out of his what would be his reward. And it seems that Jacob is going to come away completely empty-handed if it wasn't for the Lord to intervene somehow. And that even seems obvious when you read, if you skip over to tomorrow's reading and just look at 31 verse 42, that seems obvious there. Either way, celebrate with the Lord today the goodness that he is establishing in the Old Testament, and spend time asking him one of these questions today, and come back to that place. What does your relationship with the Lord look like? And celebrate that with Jesus today.